The rain came down in sheets, hammering the roof of my beat-up sedan as I sat frozen, staring at the house next door. I was 24, fresh out of college, and drowning in the monotony of suburban Ohio life until that night, when a single knock changed everything. My neighbor, Daniel, a 49-year-old widower with a limp and a guarded smile, stood drenched on my porch, asking for help I never expected to give. It was past midnight when I opened the door. Daniel's flannel clung to his frame, his graying hair plastered to his forehead. "Elliot," he said, voice trembling, I can't do it alone tonight." His words hung heavy, like the storm outside, and I didn't ask what he meant. I just grabbed my jacket and followed him into the rain, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and something I couldn't name. Daniel's house smelled of old wood and coffee, a lived-in kind of warmth that clashed with the sterile chill of his bathroom. He leaned against the sink, his bad leg trembling from an old injury he never talked about. "I can't get in the shower," he admitted, eyes avoiding mine. "It's been weeks since I could manage it properly." His voice cracked, and I saw it then the weight of shame, the kind that comes from needing someone when you've spent a lifetime standing alone. I didn't know what to say. I was just a kid who moved back to my parents' house to save money, not some hero. But there he was, a man twice my age, looking at me like I was his last hope. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's figure this out." I helped him sit on the edge of the tub, my hands awkward but gentle as I untied his boots. The intimacy of helping him undress, guiding him under the warm water wasn't something I'd been prepared for. Every move felt like crossing a line, but not the kind you'd expect. It was like stepping into someone's soul, raw and unguarded. The water ran clear, then cloudy, as weeks of neglect washed away. Daniel sat on the shower chair, his head bowed, letting the spray hit his shoulders. I stood outside the curtain, holding it steady, my sneakers soaked through. "You don't have to do this," he muttered, barely audible over the water. But I did. I didn't know why, but I did. Afterward, wrapped in a towel, he looked smaller, like the weight of the world had been scrubbed off with the dirt. We sat in his kitchen, the clock ticking past 2 a.m. And he poured me a coffee I didn't drink. "Elliot," he said, his voice low but firm, "you didn't just help me tonight. You saw me." Those words hit like a punch, unraveling something in me I hadn't known was knotted. I'd spent my life chasing love in bars and apps, but this quiet, messy moment was something deeper. The next morning, I couldn't shake it. Daniel's words echoed in my head as I mowed my parents' lawn, the hum of the mower drowning out the world. I'd always thought love was grand gestures, passionate confessions, the stuff of movies. But helping Daniel, seeing him at his most vulnerable, felt like something else entirely. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real. And real was terrifying. Over the next few weeks, I found excuses to check on him. A plate of leftovers from my mom. A question about his overgrown garden. Each time, he'd invite me in, and we'd talk about his late wife, Sarah, who died 5 years ago, about my aimless job search, about the world we both felt out of place in. Daniel was guarded, but his stories slipped out like cracks in a dam. He'd been a carpenter, a good one, until a fall from a ladder shattered his knee and his confidence. He didn't say it, but I could tell he'd been lonely ever since. One evening, as we sat on his porch watching the sunset, he told me about his youth in rural Ohio. "I was different," he said, his eyes distant. "Didn't fit in. Never could." He didn't elaborate, but I felt the weight of it, the unspoken truth hanging between us. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Not yet. By the end of that month, I was spending more time at Daniel's than at my own house. It wasn't just about helping him anymore. It was about the way his laugh lines deepened when I made a bad joke, or how he'd leave an extra coffee mug out, like he knew I'd show up. I started to notice things, how his hands shook slightly when he talked about Sarah, how he'd linger when our shoulders brushed. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew better. The air in Daniel's living room was thick with the scent of cedar and old books, a quiet comfort that made my visits feel like coming home. I was sitting on his worn leather couch, a beer in hand, while he fiddled with a radio that hadn't worked in years. "You ever think about leaving this place?" I asked, half joking, but his silence told me I'd hit something raw. He set the radio down, his hands steady but his eyes distant. "I thought about it," he said finally. "Back when I was your age. Thought I'd run off to San Francisco, live the life I couldn't hear." He chuckled, but it was hollow, like a memory that stung. I wanted to press, to ask what life he meant, but his gaze flicked to mine, and I saw the walls go up. Instead, I nodded, letting the moment pass. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling. Daniel's words gnawed at me. What had he run from? And why did I care so much? I'd dated guys before, quick flings. Nothing serious, but this was different. It wasn't just attraction. It was the way he made me feel seen. Like my restlessness wasn't a flaw, but a shared ache. The next day, I showed up at his place with a toolbox. "Your back door's creaking like hell," I said, trying to sound casual. He raised an eyebrow, but let me in, watching as I tightened hinges and sanded rough edges. It was an excuse to be near him, to fill the silence with something other than my racing thoughts. As I worked, he leaned against the counter, sipping coffee, his eyes following my every move. "You're good at this," he said, and the warmth in his voice made my chest tighten. We fell into a rhythm after that. I'd fix things around his house, leaky faucets, loose shelves, and he'd cook us dinner. Simple stuff like chili or roasted chicken. One night, as we ate, he told me about the first time he kissed a boy, back in high school. "It was behind the bleachers," he said, his voice soft. "Scared the hell out of me, but it felt right." He looked at me then, searching, and I wondered if he could hear my heart hammering. I didn't know how to respond. I'd grown up in a world where being out was easier, at least on paper, but Daniel's generation carried scars I could only imagine. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's face darkened. "He left. Said it was too hard." He didn't say more, and I didn't push. But the air between us shifted, like we'd crossed an invisible line. A week later, I found him in his backyard, struggling to prune an overgrown apple tree. His bad leg was giving him hell, and I could see the frustration etched in his face. "Let me," I said, taking the shears. Our hands brushed, and for a second, neither of us moved. His eyes met mine, and there it was, something unspoken, electric, terrifying. I stepped back, my face burning, and focused on the tree like my life depended on it. That night, he invited me to stay for a movie. We sat on his couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, the space between our knees feeling like a canyon. Halfway through some old Western, he turned to me. "Elliot, why do you keep coming back?" His voice was raw, like he'd been holding the question in for weeks. I opened my mouth, but no words came. The truth was, I didn't know. Or maybe I did, and I was too scared to admit it. "I like being here," I said finally, my voice shaky. "With you." His eyes softened, but there was fear there too, like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't unjump. He reached out, his hand hovering over mine, then pulled back, You're young, he said, almost to himself. You've got a whole life ahead of you. The words stung, like he was building a wall I couldn't climb. I left his house that night with a knot in my stomach. The street was quiet, the stars sharp above, and I realized I was falling for him hard. But Daniel wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was a man carrying decades of pain, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry it with him. Still, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to try. The Ohio summer turned brutal, the kind of heat that made the air feel like a wet blanket. I was at Daniel's again, fixing a wobbly porch step, sweat dripping down my back. He sat nearby, handing me nails, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos of my thoughts. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt like a spark, but neither of us dared fan it into a flame. That afternoon, he opened up about Sarah. She knew, he said, staring at the lemonade in his glass. About me. About who I really was. His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white. I froze, hammer in hand, waiting for more. She loved me anyway, he continued. But I never told her everything. I couldn't. The confession hung heavy, and I realized he was talking about more than just his marriage. I wanted to ask what he meant, but my phone buzzed me, Mom, reminding me about a family barbecue. I ignored it, but Daniel noticed. You should go, he said, his smile tight. Don't let me keep you from your life. It wasn't accusatory, but it stung all the same. I wanted to tell him he was my life now, or at least a part of it I couldn't imagine losing. But I just nodded and left, the distance between us feeling wider than ever. At the barbecue, my cousin Jake cornered me. You're always at that guy's place, he said, half teasing, half suspicious. What's up with that? I shrugged, muttering something about helping a neighbor, but Jake's smirk told me he wasn't buying it. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain Daniel to anyone, least of all myself. He was 49, scarred by a life I hadn't lived, and yet I felt more alive with him than I ever had with anyone my age. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. Elliot, come by tonight. Need to talk. D. My heart raced as I read it, a mix of hope and dread. When I arrived, Daniel was in the kitchen, his hands busy chopping vegetables, but his eyes were stormy. I've been thinking, he said, not looking up. About us. About what this is. My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized we were an us until he said it, and now I was terrified he'd take it back. He set the knife down, his shoulders tense. I'm too old for you, he said, his voice rough. I've got baggage you don't need. You should be out there, living, not stuck here with me. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I've spent my whole life hiding, Elliot. From who I am, from what I want. I don't want that for you. The words hit like a freight train. I stepped closer, my voice shaking. You think I'm here out of pity? I'm here because I want to be. Because you make me feel. I trailed off, searching for the right word. Alive. Seen. Loved. I didn't know how to say it without sounding like a kid with a crush. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the battle in his eyes, fear against something softer, something that mirrored what I felt. You don't know what you're signing up for, he said, but his voice was quieter now, less certain. I took another step, close enough to feel the heat of him. Then show me, I said. For a moment, I thought he'd kiss me. His hand twitched, like he wanted to reach out, but then he turned away, grabbing the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. I need time, he whispered. I nodded, even though it hurt, and left him there, the weight of his words settling into my bones. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his confession. The way he'd said he'd spent his life hiding. I thought about my own life out since I was 16, but still dodging questions from relatives. Still feeling like I had to prove something. Daniel wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a mirror, showing me parts of myself I hadn't faced. And I was determined to show him he didn't have to hide anymore. The days after Daniel's confession felt like walking on glass, every step careful. Every word weighed. I kept my distance, giving him the time he asked for. But it didn't stop me from replaying that almost moment in his kitchen. I was falling for him, and the realization was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. One evening, I found him sitting on his porch, a beer in hand, staring at the stars. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant it to be. He nodded, sliding over to make room. We sat in silence for a while, the crickets filling the space between us. Then he spoke, his voice low. "I was in love once. With a man. Before Sarah." My breath caught, but I stayed quiet, letting him unravel. "His name was Michael," he said. "We were 20, working construction together. He was fearless, out when it wasn't safe to be." Daniel's voice cracked, and he took a long sip of his beer. "He got beat up one night. Bad. I didn't stop it. I was too scared." The shame in his words was palpable, and I wanted to reach out, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But I didn't. He left town after that. Daniel continued. "I never saw him again. Married Sarah to prove I could be normal." I swallowed hard, the weight of his story settling over me. "You loved her," I said, not a question. He nodded. "I did. But not the way she deserved. Not the way I loved Michael." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw him unguarded. Raw. "I don't want to make the same mistake with you." My heart pounded. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, his jaw tight. "It means I'm scared, Elliot. Scared of what this could be. Scared of what it'd do to you." I wanted to argue, to tell him I wasn't afraid. But the truth was, I was. Not of him, but of the world we lived in. The one that still judged, still hurt. The next day, I went to the local library, digging through old newspapers for anything about Michael. I don't know why it felt like chasing a ghost, but I needed to understand Daniel's past. I found a small article from 1995, a vague report about an assault outside a bar. No names, but the details matched. I sat there, staring at the faded print, imagining a young Daniel, frozen in fear as the man he loved bled on the pavement. When I showed up at his house that night, I didn't mention the article. Instead, I asked him to tell me more about Michael. He hesitated, then talked for hours about stolen kisses in empty parking lots, about dreams of a life they never got to live. By the end, his eyes were wet, and I reached for his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. His fingers curled around mine, rough and warm, and it felt like a promise. But the world wasn't done with us. The next morning, I found a note taped to my car. "Fag." One word, scrawled in black marker. My stomach churned as I ripped it off, glancing at Daniel's house. Had someone seen us? Known something we hadn't even admitted to ourselves? I didn't tell him about it, but the fear lingered, a shadow over every moment we spent together. That weekend, Daniel asked me to help him clean out his attic. It was a mess of boxes and memories, Sarah's old dresses, his carpentry tools, a photo of a younger Daniel with a man who had to be Michael, both of them laughing under a summer sky. "I kept this," he said, holding the photo. Even when I tried to forget. I looked at him, at the lines etched into his face, and realized love wasn't just about the present. It was about carrying the past, scars and all, and choosing to move forward anyway. As we sat among the boxes, dust motes floating in the sunlight, I leaned closer. "I'm not Michael," I said, my voice steady. "And you're not that kid anymore. We're here now." For the first time, he didn't look away. He leaned in, and when our lips met, it wasn't fireworks or movie magic. It was quiet, real, and more powerful than anything I'd ever known. That kiss changed everything. It wasn't just a moment. It was a door swinging open, letting in light and fear in equal measure. Daniel and I didn't talk about it after, but the air between us hummed with something new, something fragile yet undeniable. The next morning, I woke to another note on my car. "Leave him alone." My hands shook as I crumpled it, my eyes darting to Daniel's house. I wanted to believe it was a prank, some bored kid messing around, but the word from the first note still burned in my mind. I didn't tell Daniel. He was already carrying enough, and I wasn't sure he could handle more. Instead, I threw myself into being there for him. We spent evenings on his porch, sharing stories about our lives, mine full of reckless college nights, his of quieter, heavier moments. One night, he told me about the first Pride parade he'd seen, back in the 90s, from a distance. "I wanted to join them," he said, his voice thick. "But I couldn't. I was too afraid of what it had cost." I reached for his hand, and this time, he held on tight. But the notes kept coming. Every few days, "Another one, you don't belong here. He's too old for you. Disgusting." I started parking my car in the garage, checking my windows before dawn, but the fear crept in anyway. I wasn't just scared for myself. I was scared for Daniel, for what this could do to him. He'd spent decades hiding, and now I was pulling him into the open, into a world that hadn't changed as much as I'd hoped. One afternoon, I caught my cousin Jake staring at Daniel's house from across the street. "You know what people are saying, right?" he said when I confronted him. "They're talking about you too. It's not just me." My stomach twisted, but I kept my voice steady. "Let them talk," I said, but inside, I was reeling. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the neighborhood, the town, the weight of eyes we couldn't see. That night, I told Daniel about the notes. His face went pale, his hands clenching the edge of the table. "This is why," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is why I stayed quiet all those years. I wanted to argue, to tell him we could face it together, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting a battle you know you might lose. Still, we didn't pull back. We couldn't. The next day, I helped him paint his living room, a soft blue he said Sarah would have loved. We laughed, splattered paint on each other, and for a few hours, the world outside didn't exist. When he kissed me again, it was different, Fireser, like he was claiming something he'd denied himself for too long. I kissed him back, my hands in his hair, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. But the world always finds a way in. That night, someone threw a brick through Daniel's front window. The crash woke us both, and we stumbled downstairs to find glass scattered across the floor. A note tied to the brick, "Get out." Daniel's hands shook as he read it, and I saw something break in him, something I wasn't sure I could fix. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice hollow. I grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at me. "We're not running," I said, my voice fiercer than I felt. "This is your home. Our home." He didn't respond, but he let me hold him, his head against my chest, and I knew we were in this together, no matter what came next. The next morning, we called the police. They took a report, but their shrugs told me they didn't care much. Probably just kids, one officer said, and I wanted to scream. Instead, I taped cardboard over the window and started asking neighbors if they'd seen anything. Most avoided my eyes, but Mrs. Carter, an older woman down the street, pulled me aside. "Be careful, Elliot," she said. "Not everyone here is as kind as they seem." Her words chilled me, but they also lit a fire. I wasn't going to let fear win. The cardboard over Daniel's window felt like a scar, a reminder of the world's cruelty. We didn't talk about it much, but the silence between us was heavier now, laced with unspoken fears. Still, I showed up every day, hammering nails, scrubbing floors, anything to keep us moving forward. One evening, as we sat on his couch, Daniel turned to me. "You could leave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to stay in this mess." I looked at him, at the lines etched deep in his face, and felt a surge of something fierce. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and I meant it. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, like he was starting to believe me. We started being more careful locking doors, closing blinds, but we didn't hide. I held his hand when we walked to the mailbox, a small act of defiance that made my heart race. Some neighbors stared, others turned away, but a few, like Mrs. Carter, smiled. "You boys keep being you," she said one day, handing us a plate of cookies. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline. Then came the town meeting. Someone had proposed a neighborhood safety ordinance, a thinly veiled attack on undesirable behavior. I knew it was about us. Daniel didn't want to go, but I convinced him. "We can't let them silence us," I said, and he nodded, his jaw tight. The meeting was a blur of angry voices and pointed fingers, but when I stood up to speak, my voice didn't shake. "Love isn't a threat," I said, looking straight at the crowd. "Fear is." Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, and I felt stronger than I ever had. The ordinance didn't pass, but the tension didn't fade. The notes stopped, but the whispers didn't. One night, I found Daniel in his backyard, staring at the apple tree we'd pruned together. "I want to be brave," he said, his voice breaking. "For you." I pulled him close, my lips against his forehead, and whispered, "You already are." The next week, we decided to host a barbecue. It was a risk, but we wanted to show the neighborhood we weren't hiding. We invited everyone, Mrs. Carter, the young couple across the street, even Jake, who showed up with a six-pack and an awkward apology. Not everyone came, but those who did laughed, ate, and for a few hours, it felt like we belonged. Daniel's smile was brighter than I'd ever seen, and when he kissed me in front of everyone, I heard a few gasps, but also a soft cheer from Mrs. Carter. That night, as we cleaned up, Daniel told me about a dream he'd had, a life where he didn't have to hide, where we could build something real. "I want that," he said, his voice steady. "With you." My heart swelled, but before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You'll regret this." My blood ran cold, but I didn't show Daniel. I deleted it and pulled him close, determined to protect what we had. The next day, I found a local LGBTQ support group online and convinced Daniel to go with me. The meeting was in a small community center, filled with people of all ages, sharing stories that echoed ours. Daniel was quiet at first, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I spent 49 years hiding," he said. "I'm done with that." The room erupted in applause, and I felt tears prick my eyes. For the first time, I saw him as he was not just my neighbor, but a man reclaiming his life. As we drove home, Daniel reached for my hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. for seeing me. I squeezed his hand, my heart full. We were building something, not just for us, but for everyone who'd ever felt like they didn't belong. And no note, no brick, no whisper could take that away. The support group became our lifeline. Every Wednesday, Daniel and I drove to the community center, our hands intertwined in the car, the world outside feeling a little less hostile. He was opening up more, not just to me, but to the group, sharing stories of his past with a courage I hadn't seen before. Each meeting chipped away at the walls he'd built, and I fell for him a little harder every time he spoke. But the threats didn't stop. Another note appeared, this time on Daniel's doorstep. "You're not welcome here." I wanted to hunt down whoever was doing this, but Daniel shook his head. "They want us to be afraid," he said. "Let's not give them that." His strength floored me, but I could see the toll it was taking, the way his hands shook when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he checked the locks twice before bed. One night, as we lay in his bed, the moonlight spilling through the curtains, he told me about his biggest fear. "I'm scared I'll hold you back," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're young, Elliot. You could have anyone." I turned to him, my hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I don't want anyone," I said. "I want you." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and for a moment, the world was just us. But the next morning, reality crashed in. Someone had spray-painted fags across Daniel's garage. The word glared at us, red and ugly, as we stood in the driveway. I grabbed a can of paint, ready to cover it, but Daniel stopped me. "Let it stay," he said, his voice steady. "Let them see we're not running." I wanted to argue, but the fire in his eyes stopped me. He was done hiding, and so was I. We started planning a response not just to the vandalism, but to the hate. With the support group's help, we organized a small pride event in the neighborhood park. It wasn't much, a few tables, some rainbow flags, music from a portable speaker, but it was ours. Daniel helped hang banners, his bad legs slowing him down but not stopping him. When he caught me watching, he grinned, and I saw the man he might have been if the world had been kinder. The event wasn't perfect. Some neighbors showed up. Others drove by with glares. Jake came, surprising me, and even helped hand out flyers. But halfway through, a group of guys, local troublemakers, I recognized a few, started shouting slurs from across the street. My stomach clenched, but Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," he said. The crowd around us cheered, and the guys slunk away, but I saw the fear in Daniel's eyes. He was brave, but he wasn't invincible. That night, we sat on his porch, exhausted but alive. "I never thought I'd do something like that," he said, his hand in mine. I leaned against him, my head on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you know," I said. He chuckled, but it was soft, like he was starting to believe it. The next day, Mrs. Carter stopped by with a petition for a neighborhood inclusivity pledge. She said, her eyes twinkling. "Thought you boys might want to sign." We did, and so did half the street. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just fighting to exist, we were building something better. As summer faded into fall, Daniel and I grew closer, our lives intertwining in ways I hadn't imagined. We cooked together, laughed together, faced the world together. The threats didn't stop completely, but they slowed, and we learned to live with them. Love, I realized, wasn't just about the good moments. It was about standing together through the hard ones, about choosing each other every day. Fall painted the neighborhood in golds and reds, but the air carried a chill that wasn't just the weather. Daniel and I had built something real, something worth fighting for. but the weight of the world still pressed against us. Every step forward felt like a victory, every quiet moment a gift. One morning, I found Daniel in his backyard, planting tulip bulbs for spring. "Something to look forward to," he said, his hands covered in dirt. I knelt beside him, digging holes, our shoulders brushing. It was ordinary, but it felt profound, like we were planting more than flowers. We were planting a future. The threats hadn't stopped completely, but they'd changed. No more notes or bricks, just whispers. Cold stares. The occasional car slowing by his house. We kept going, leaning on the support group, on Mrs. Carter, on the neighbors who'd signed the pledge. Jake even started coming around more, his apologies turning into real conversations. "I was wrong," he admitted one day, his voice low. "You and Daniel, it's real." I nodded, grateful, but my eyes were on Daniel, who was laughing with Mrs. Carter over a cup of coffee. That was what mattered. One night, as we lay in bed, Daniel turned to me, his eyes serious. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Before I met you, I thought my life was over. Just waiting out the years. But you changed that." My throat tightened, and I reached for his hand. "You changed me too," I said. "I didn't know what love could be until you." He smiled, but there was a shadow in it. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "Not of us, but of what's out there." I pulled him close, my lips against his temple. "We'll face it together," I said, and for the first time, I felt like we could. The next week, we got a call from the community center. They wanted to honor us at their annual gala for our work with the Pride event. Daniel hesitated, but I saw the spark in his eyes. "Let's do it," I said, and he nodded, his hand finding mine. The gala was small but warm, filled with people who'd become our family. When Daniel spoke, his voice was steady, powerful. "Love is worth the fight," he said, his eyes on me. "Every single day?" The room erupted, and I felt tears on my cheeks, not from sadness, but from pride. That night, as we danced under cheap string lights, Daniel whispered, "I love you." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but it hit differently, like a vow. "I love you too," I said, and we held each other, the world fading away. Months later, spring arrived, and the tulips bloomed bright, defiant, beautiful. We stood in Daniel's backyard, hand in hand, watching them sway in the breeze. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was changing. People waved now. Some even stopped to chat. The hate hadn't vanished, but it was quieter, drowned out by the love we'd built. Daniel turned to me, his eyes soft but strong. "You saw me," he said, echoing those words from that first night. "And you stayed." I smiled, my heart full. "Always," I said. And as we stood there, surrounded by flowers we'd planted together, I realized love wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about what you grew in its aftermath, something enduring, something real. The world would always have its shadows, but we had each other. And that was enough.